Do you want to intro this one or should I?
Sure, I'll start.
All
It
right.
should be very quick for me, unlike typical. My general rule on homebrew,
Wait,
it, you want to
let's
establish
make
it?
sure. No, no. Establish it, but make sure you separate as well between the DM using it and the player using it.
Alrighty, yeah. Homebrew is this thing where people come up with stuff that is not original to the system or the official publisher. Say like, uh, you might come up with an alternate class or feats or spells or magic items or adventures. Some homebrew is more commonly tolerated across more broad groups, such as adventures, which are universal, while other homebrew, like species and classes, are much more touchy subjects. As for the DM is the arbiter of the world, and they have the general veto power on what homebrew is accepted in the world. Generally, homebrew rules or modifications to the system are also somewhat accepted by not all groups, but by some. And generally, it's best when the DM announces or puts the homebrew rules up in session zero. It is important then.
I'm not supposed to bring up my homebrew 10 sessions into the game,
It's
letting them know that their class feature doesn't work that way.
Yeah, or something else on the side. Sometimes, by the way, we there's occasions where homebrew will be brought in later sessions, such as sometimes basically based on a joke, like the fact that we were adventuring through Rift's adventure, and I kept making jokes whenever my ranger made friends with various animals or characters. Oh, I got to bear points because I talked with the bears and I made friends with them and such and so forth. And eventually, as a player, I've done that so much that he literally put together a system for reputation points for Dungeons and Dragons for the campaign, and now we have a outline of that whole tier system and different factions that we've already befriended and have positive and negative points with.
Yes.
So generally, homebrew, as I said, is in the domain of the DM to approve, and the players may suggest homebrew. It is best as a player if you suggest homebrew and the DM says no to it. Um, it's nice to know why as a player, but it's also important that the DM is trying to build a world and has a lot of stuff going on. So if it's a like really simple suggestion or something like that, or it goes against the world lore, just kind of accept it. Maybe in the future, if you decide to be a DM and allow that homebrew in your campaign, then the DM might be open to it in the future, in his future or her future campaigns, and so forth.
Worth noting,
Yeah.
there, if you're on that situation as a player where your homebrew isn't accepted by the DM, it's not even necessarily just because it's homebrew. There's a lot of things that aren't homebrew that aren't going to get allowed at your table as well. An example of something that's not homebrew would be things from, like, let's say, Spelljammer, like a plasmoid, right?
Yeah.
A lo-
There's some DMs who literally ban entire books
yeah,
of official stuff.
which they are rightfully allowed to do so, absolutely.
I don't do that.
I don't do that either.
Yeah.
Uh, but continuing into that, though, so let's say, so from a DM's perspective, before we deep dive into it all, if you are the DM, are you totally fine with you using homebrew? That can include modifying stat blocks.
Yeah.
That can include making your creatures have interesting abilities, adding in different species, things like that that aren't inherently available in any book.
It gets simpler than that. As a DM, when you're reading a world setting, that is technically itself homebrew. And
Absolutely correct.
that is the single most common type of homebrew is a home setting. That's one of the core reasons why a lot of DMs DM is because they get to create a world and have its own lore.
So, very simply,
Yeah.
same page. Absolutely, yes. Homebrew, everything. Well, not necessarily everything, but literally as much as you want, to your heart's content.
Yeah,
As a DM.
it is important. Yeah, go ahead and homebrew, but some homebrew stuff is more painful or easier than others. The world settings is as long as you follow the general logic of the Dungeons and Dragons or whatever TTRPG system you're playing, homebrewing a setting with its own little set of gods and social orders and stuff like that works out perfectly fine. If you start modifying rules based on your setting, that might drive some players' blood pressure up, as some players like to engineer or plan their characters very carefully around the mechanics of the system. So if you start changing the interactions of the mechanics based on your home setting, which by the way was actually an exceedingly common thing back in Advanced Dungeons and Dragons
Yes.
and Advanced Dungeons and Dragons 2nd Edition and even Dungeons and Dragons 3.5, where different settings had different rules where you couldn't say like use magic higher than a certain level, or
Yeah.
there was no races other than just human in the Langmar setting, or a few others where you had a restriction on other races, like there's no elves or stuff like that. Then some players might have a little issue with that.
So, homebrew fine as a DM, but be reasonable, especially if you're adjusting core mechanics.
Frank Fluff.
Especially if you're adjusting core mechanics. Example, if you're changing combat to everyone rolls a d4 instead of a d20, and then that decides initiative order, right? If you make some kind of weird means like that, or something that greatly tangibly affects how the game is played, you should absolutely talk to your players
Yeah,
in a session zero format.
You remove initiative and you just have it as stacked number.
Yeah, swords don't exist in my world.
Yeah.
So, if you're inherently changing big, pivotal, important things, as a DM, you should talk to your players on it. But to a lesser degree, if you're just like, okay, this is a bigger orc, then that's why it has 40% more health, just do it, right?
He's a Bork.
He's a Bork. So, with that, what about if your player comes to you with homebrew? Are you going to entertain it?
I typically don't have players that bring me homebrew.
Am I going to need to come to you with a homebrew class?
See, that's on the hard end of the scale. Some things, like from the perspective of players, like homebrew spells and maybe a homebrew feat or something like that, is simpler because it's not. It's a simple contained thing that you can make a quick assessment about and approve or disapprove. But when you start going from simple small
spell
things
to a full class
to say a species has a little more complex interaction, that gets a little harder. And then when you get to a class, you then have to read the whole thing and figure out the interactions of all those mechanics in comparison to the other classes, because sometimes you'll have like a class that someone has found on the internet that has a damage resistance of 5 to everything.
Yeah.
And that's not something in Dungeons and Dragons 5th edition, but I had a group a long time ago, like early 5th edition, that there was homebrew classes that came out for 5th edition super early on that had D&D 3.5 mechanics in them, like damage resistances to various elements, like a +5 or +10 or 15
Yeah.
damage resistance. And that really creates a situation where the character basically eats a lot of damage easily. And then it becomes more difficult to balance around them because then you end up having to create monsters that do way more damage, but then the fighter right next to them dies to a single hit that barely does anything to this character,
Yep.
or so forth. So in the case of classes and even some extent spells and species, it's more touchy. I typically haven't had anyone ever bring me
I'm
a
totally
homebrew,
hitting you with a homebrew class.
and I typically don't allow them. I'm in that class of people who, when it comes to the players, I literally don't care if it's like official stuff. You can combine all the official stuff however you want it. You can have the most OP wizard combo ever, where you took like all the most powerful spells. You combined a wizard with a rogue, so you can have a plus 40 stealth and stuff like that.
Sure.
Add in a 50 AC and shit like that.
Yeah, but
I'm
because it was rules as written,
it's easier. I know there's that stuff, and then I also have the book itself, so I can always pick up the book and read the class through and figure it out myself. But when someone just says, "Hey, I got this homebrew class off of like D&D 5e forum or something like that," you that's the complicated part, because then I have to remember I have to keep that link into that somewhere, and I got a lot of clutter as it is.
that's reasonable.
Yeah.
So you wouldn't allow a homebrew class, or it would depend.
I haven't had anyone give me a homebrew class in ages.
When we finish recording this, or if you want to even now, I can try and pull up the one that I ran in a Matt campaign.
You're talking about the commoner?
Yes.
From what you describe, it's not terrible.
It wasn't. It was like a... Here, pause a second. 1 second.
But you're going to have to put that up like D&D Beyond or something.
Yeah. Well, or I'd have to do it on pencil and paper.
Yeah.
Skipping all the exposition of explaining what the commoner is, you can say no. Is it something you'd allow at your table?
I want to read it through myself.
That's fair.
Yeah.
All right.
I
So
basically got to the end of my homebrew thing.
if your player hits you with a homebrew magic item, is there any chance you give that to them?
Not instantaneously unless it's really weak.
Got it. Same deal. Feat.
Depends on the power level of the feat.
So it's not out of the question.
It's not out of the
you
question.
have to review it.
Yeah, I have to review it, and then this is not a origin feat. This is a regular feat. So therefore you gain access to it at 4th level, as opposed to when it says origin feat.
Yeah.
So you have to level up for it, but or give me say a species. Species are typically shorter than, say, classes, so it's easier to make a quick assessment about those. And sometimes I'll just no or yes on them.
Yeah.
Because you might not want to have a character that does damage to all the enemies around them every time an enemy attacks them with a physical attack.
Yeah. Big ol' thorns damage is broken.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And has resistance to all damage, all physical damage,
and also has access to wish,
or
from the
wish,
species,
or has the ability to fly for an hour, or instantly at level 1.
Well, to be fair, there's a lot of species that have access to just flight, with no limited time.
Yeah.
Well, not a lot, like 3.
Well, I'm talking about stacking all those things on top.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, you're a genie. You can fly wherever you want, and you cast wish, and you have immunity to or resistance to, say,
bludgeoning, piercing, slashing.
Yeah, and your element of choice, like you're a water genie, you have resistance to or immunity to bludgeoning or something like that, or cold damage. No, that's too overpowered.
So, We're in the same boat for sure on as a DM. I am totally good with doing as much homebrew as I want to. I tend to not mess with the core game mechanics. And if I do, I make it explicitly clear that that's something that I'm doing. If it's something that I'm doing where I mess with the core game mechanics, I am likely doing it in a one shot as a test to try it out. It's not a full fledged campaign of adjust this thing.
Yeah,
Right.
I typically have done that too. I've tried my social initiative in a one shot, and found that it has different levels of interaction with different groups, and that might be the case with some homebrew where it's not simply whether it's overpowered or underpowered, but it might not be the right homebrew rule for the right group. Like gritty homebrew rules,
Yeah.
like all your characters don't get your con onto your die, or you say like everyone has one die less.
Yeah.
This so like the wizard has a D4, the
Yeah.
barbarian has a D10, and the paladin has like a D8,
Yeah.
and so forth.
So
Which would also make a rogue a D4 as well.
So I'm good with adjusting that stuff as a DM. If a player hits me with homebrew, it really depends on what it is they're bringing me. I am in agreement that it depends on what they are bringing me. Depending what it is, if I say yes, that's their problem. Example, if it's a feat that can be maybe easy to implement as just adding a custom feat, right? But adding a custom class can be very difficult to implement into, let's say, something like D&D Beyond. If I say yes to your homebrew class, you're kind of locking yourself into you're going to do that on a character sheet
Yeah, for a long period of time.
for a long period of time, which is a lot of additional effort that the other players aren't going to have to deal with. And
Yeah.
if that's something you can do very well without it bogging down the game, that's fine. But if your restriction or thing that you've added is now creating this giant time sink to every session, that's problematic, and maybe we're not doing that.
Say like a homebrew necromancer class, that's where you gain in special charges of raising dead in your environment.
And now it's giving you like 4 different undead that you're constantly controlling.
You have an army of 50 undead wandering around you, and you're unstoppable at level 5.
Not even that. It doesn't even get that broken. Even if you're like you have 5 undead, and now you've got to control all of them on the end of your turn, and now you've added 5 extra things onto every single thing of initiative. That's at minimum 5 additional rolls on every initiative in terms of damage. Not even an initiative tracker, right? Assume all are at the end of its turn. That's just too much.
The simple solution to that is you group them.
Yeah.
And you use the mob rules. Well, it's from the 2014 in Dungeon Master's Guide for attacking.
But depending what it is, I would absolutely allow it. I would just have to gauge how broken it's going to be in the game that I'm running. But I would be open to a homebrew class. I would just need to review it and make my opinions. I think that I would be more.
And potential adjustments.
Yeah, and potential adjustments. I would be more likely to accept a homebrew non-spellcaster than I would a homebrew spellcaster.
As per usual, that'd probably be the easiest, the best route. Spellcasters have that quadratic tendency. The moment you have a class, and it might not be the most broken thing ever, but then a new book comes out that's official, and now you have a new interaction with the spells in that class and subclass, and then you have a ridiculously overpowered character.
Exactly. There's certain combinations of spells that you can't or you won't necessarily see coming that, oh, this is actually really broken having these in conjunction with these, that it's to some extent better to disallow it or let it ride, and when it becomes a problem, disallow it.
Yeah.
But if you do that second route where you let it ride and then disallow it, that can understandably create frustrations for a player.
Oh, trust me, I've seen that. By the way,
Yeah.
Cole was DMing a group, and he had a player that had chose a class that had tons of abilities and resistances, and a few things release, and then all of a sudden the class is completely unstoppable, and it got ridiculous really fast. And
Yeah.
then Cole said, "Oh no, oh I didn't realize that the class had like damage resistance 20 and he at level 10,
Yeah.
so it's 10 now." And then the player's like, "Oh," and he moans and gets bothered by it,
Yep.
and then you have a conflict between people.
Which is unfortunate. So I suppose it comes down to communication and really looking it over before you okay it. But I am okay with accepting homebrew for my players.
Yep.
We're on the same page.
Yeah. As a player, I don't use homebrew.
I tend not to. It's more of a situation of I don't want to make the DM have to deal with that.
Yeah.
But I think I'd hit you with the commoner or something of that nature.
Okay.
All right, that's my thoughts on homebrew. I'm all for it. As a DM, absolutely. As a player playing and using it, I tend to avoid using it unless the DM is explicitly giving it to me. Example, they give me a shotgun that has number of uses per day, magic item refresh, right? That's cool, that's fun. They gave it to me. That means they were cool with it. But
Yep.
as a player, I don't try and bring my own homebrew to the table.
Same here.
All right, that's our thoughts on homebrew. John and Jason over here with tabletop wisdom
And Athena.
and Athena. All right, if you made it this far, thank you for being here. But we'll see you next time.
Yep. Don't forget to subscribe. Consider hitting like or dislike depending on how you feel about the video, and then sharing it either for or insightful wisdom or for laughs.
Yes, absolutely.
Have a delightful day.
Thank you for being here. Have a good one.